There is a sentence from a Chinese government source that CNN published 2 days ago that I have not been able to move past. The source was speaking anonymously, a person familiar with Beijing's thinking ahead of the May 14th summit. And they said this: the current situation has actually turned out to be favorable to China. That sentence from inside the Chinese government about a war that has killed thousands of people, closed the world's most important oil route, pushed gas prices in America to 454, and consumed 67 days of the world's attention. Favorable to China. I want to spend this video explaining exactly what that means. Why Jinping is walking into the Beijing summit with more leverage than any Chinese leader has held in a negotiation with an American president in a generation. And why the choice she is about to hand Trump is one that America genuinely cannot refuse. Trump flies to Beijing on May 14th. That is 8 days from now. And the situation he is flying into is not the situation he planned for when he launched this war on February 28th. Let me give you the picture as it stands today, because I think the gap between what Trump expected and what actually happened is the whole story of this summit. Trump delayed his original March visit to Beijing because the war in Iran was supposed to be finished by then. His advisors told him a quick win in Iran would give him leverage going into the summit. He would arrive in Beijing having demonstrated American military power, having reopened Hormuz, having removed Iran's nuclear threat, and having done it in weeks, he would arrive strong. That is not what happened. Instead, Trump arrives in Beijing 67 days into a war that has not ended. Hormuz is still effectively closed. Iran has not agreed to any nuclear terms. America has launched and canceled its own operation to escort ships through the Strait in 48 hours. Gas is at 454. Trump's approval rating has fallen to 36%, the lowest of his second term, driven primarily by economic dissatisfaction. Tied to the war, the one-page peace proposal that America floated this week has not been accepted by Iran. And today, Iran's foreign minister finished meetings in Beijing with Wang Yi, where China publicly backed Iran's right to pursue nuclear energy while asking Iran to consider reopening Hormuz. China was in the room with Iran today. Trump arrives in that same room in 8 days. The Chinese source CNN spoke to said something else that I want to read you exactly. They said Trump delayed his visit to Beijing, probably partly feeling he hasn't got enough leverage. And then they said, speaking about the war, but look at him now. The standoff in Iran has dragged for so long with no progress. That is a Chinese government insider describing Trump's position before the summit. No leverage, no progress. The quick win he was counting on did not happen. Now, let me explain the specific choice. Xi Jinping is going to hand Trump in Beijing because I think understanding the structure of that choice is the most important thing you can know about where this war ends. China's position going into this summit has 3 components, and all 3 of them put Trump in a position where every option he has comes with a cost he does not want to pay. The first component is Iran's oil. China buys approximately 90% of Iranian oil exports. This is confirmed by the United States government. China's purchases fund the Iranian government. They fund the IRGC. They give Iran the economic runway to keep Hormuz closed, to reject American peace proposals, to fly its foreign minister to Beijing instead of calling Trump. Without China's oil purchases, Iran's ability to sustain this standoff collapses within months. With China's oil purchases, Iran can wait indefinitely. Trump knows this. He said on CNBC weeks ago that he thought he had an understanding with Xi about weapons shipments. He said China broke that understanding. His response was a shrug. That's the way war goes. He moved on. The reason he moved on is the first component of Xi's leverage. America cannot sanction China's oil purchases from Iran without triggering a confrontation that would dwarf the Iran war itself. Secondary sanctions on Chinese banks, on Chinese energy companies, on the dark fleet infrastructure that moves Iranian crude to Chinese refineries would mean financial warfare against the world's second largest economy. It would collapse the trade truce the two sides negotiated in Busan last October. It would make the Beijing summit impossible. And it would do all of that while America is already managing $4.54 gas and a 36% approval rating. She does not need to say any of this in the meeting. Trump already knows it. The unspoken fact in the room is that China is keeping Iran's war machine funded, and America cannot stop it without starting a bigger fight. That is leverage component one. The second component is Taiwan. Brookings published an analysis days ago describing what China wants from this summit. And one of the key signals Beijing has been sending is that Taiwan cannot be avoided. China wants Trump to endorse principles that she has championed: win-win cooperation, peaceful coexistence, mutual respect. And baked into those principles from Beijing's perspective is American recognition of China's core interests, specifically Taiwan. The Brookings analysts noted that China may ask Trump to impose constraints on American arms sales to Taiwan. They noted that China rolled out export controls against Japan. Immediately after the Trump-Xi meeting in Busan last October, without significant pushback from the Trump administration, Xi is going to test how much Taiwan policy flexibility Trump has in the room. And Trump, who needs to come home from Beijing with anything that looks like a diplomatic win after 67 days of an unfinished war, may be more flexible than his advisors want him to be. That is leverage component two. The third component is the most immediate and the most relevant to the Iran war specifically. She can offer Trump the thing Trump needs most right now to end the war: pressure on Iran to accept the one-page deal. China pressed Iran today in the Wang Yi-Araqchi meeting to stop threatening Gulf infrastructure and to move toward reopening Hormuz. CNN reported that Al Jazeera reported it. The CNBC analysis confirmed it. China is increasingly frustrated with Iran's continued closure of the Strait. China imports roughly a third of its oil through Hormuz, and the closure is starting to hurt China's economy. China's crude and gas imports fell in March compared to a year ago. The dark fleet compensates for Iranian crude, but cannot replace the Saudi, Emirati, and Qatari supply that also used to flow through the Strait. So China genuinely wants Hormuz open, not for America's sake, for China's own economic interests. And that creates the choice. She can offer Trump this. China will lean on Iran to accept the one-page deal and reopen Hormuz. In exchange, Trump gives China something on Taiwan, something on tariffs, something on the trade relationship that China values. The choice is not between peace and war. The choice is between what Trump is willing to give Beijing to get Beijing to deliver threat. That is the deal structure she is going to present. And the reason America cannot refuse it is simple. Trump has no other path to ending this war before the November midterms. Every other option either requires military escalation that America's European allies will not support and that risks expanding the conflict or requires Iran to voluntarily call Trump, as Trump has repeatedly asked, which Iran has shown zero indication of doing. The only third party with enough leverage over Iran to change its calculation is China, and China is about to name its price. The Eurasian Review analysis published this week described the summit's potential outcomes in the bluntest terms I have seen from any analyst. It said Trump's approval rating has fallen to 36%. It said the summit is likely to be viewed as a key test of Trump's leadership on the global stage. And it said Trump was hoping to use a quick win in Iran as political leverage in Beijing. But the quick win did not happen. Now, let me bring in what happened in Beijing today, because it is the most important preparation for the summit, and nobody is fully connecting it to the May 14th meeting. Araji arrived in Beijing this morning. He met Wang Yi. This is the first face-to-face meeting between the Iranian and Chinese foreign ministers since the war began on February 28th. For 67 days, they spoke only by phone. The meeting in Beijing today was not symbolic. It was strategic, calculated, and timed with extraordinary precision. Only 8 days remain before Donald Trump is scheduled to arrive in Beijing, and in those 8 days, the balance of information may already have shifted decisively in China's favor. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi did not travel to Beijing for ceremony. According to multiple regional reports and diplomatic observers, he arrived carrying Iran's most sensitive wartime calculations directly into the hands of Chinese leadership. What happened inside that room matters because it may shape not only the future of the war, but also the future structure of American power in the Middle East and Asia simultaneously. The timing alone tells the story. China met with Iran before meeting with Trump. That means when Trump arrives in Beijing, Xi Jinping will already possess something Washington does not fully have. Iran's current red lines, Iran's negotiating flexibility, and Iran's latest position on the proposed one-page framework designed to end the conflict. Beijing now enters the summit with informational superiority. Xi will know what America wants from Iran and what Iran may actually be willing to concede. Trump, meanwhile, walks into the room understanding only one side of the equation, America's demands. That asymmetry changes everything. Iran's first objective in Beijing was straightforward but critical. Tehran wanted its position delivered directly to China before Trump could shape the narrative himself. Whatever Araghchi communicated to Wang Yi today becomes part of China's strategic leverage during the summit. Beijing now holds insight into the negotiating boundaries that Washington still appears uncertain about. That gives China the ability to position itself not merely as a participant, but as the indispensable bridge between two governments that currently cannot reach an agreement alone. The second objective was even more consequential. Iran reportedly came seeking guarantees regarding what China may or may not offer Trump behind closed doors. Tehran understands that Beijing now holds enormous leverage over the trajectory of the war. If China were to privately assure Trump of concessions affecting Iran's oil exports, regional standing, or future security arrangements without Tehran's knowledge, Iran's negotiating position could collapse overnight. Araghchi's visit was therefore not only diplomatic outreach, it was a preemptive effort to prevent Iran from becoming bargaining currency inside a larger US-China deal. The third objective centered on survival and long-term strategic continuity. Iran needed reassurance that the 2021 China-Iran strategic partnership would remain intact, regardless of what emerges from the Beijing summit. That agreement, stretching across 25 years, guarantees large-scale Chinese purchases of Iranian oil at preferential pricing and anchors Iran economically against Western sanctions pressure. Tehran's leadership understands that if China adjusts its position under American pressure, Iran loses far more than diplomatic support. It risks losing the economic lifeline, sustaining its wartime resilience. So by May 14th, Xi Jinping will sit across from Donald Trump, already having spoken directly with Iran's leadership only days earlier. He will know Iran's minimum demands, its fears, and its limits. Trump arrives without equivalent access. Xi understands both negotiating positions simultaneously, while Washington remains largely confined to its own strategic assumptions. That reality transforms China from observer into gatekeeper. And Beijing knows it. The central question now is not whether China can help end the conflict. The central question is what China will demand in exchange for doing so. Analysts increasingly point toward three major areas where Beijing may seek concessions. The first is trade. The current trade truce between Washington and Beijing remains fragile and temporary. China wants something more durable. American tariffs continue to pressure Chinese manufacturing and exports while slowing broader economic recovery inside China itself. If Xi can help Trump engineer a pathway toward ending the war, Trump gains a domestic political victory at a moment of mounting pressure. In exchange, China may push for tariff relief, expanded market access, or long-term stabilization of trade relations. Trump could then frame the agreement domestically as strategic success. China cooperates on Middle East stability, while America receives economic commitments and de-escalation abroad. Politically, that becomes sellable. Strategically, however, it gives Beijing substantial breathing room at precisely the moment Washington has attempted to constrain Chinese economic power. The second possible concession involves Taiwan. This is where the stakes become historically significant. For Beijing, Taiwan remains the core issue around which all long-term strategic calculations revolve. Some analysts believe China may seek softer American positioning on arms sales, military coordination, or diplomatic language regarding Taiwan's future status. Trump has repeatedly emphasized his personal relationship with Xi Jinping in the past, often favoring leader-to-leader negotiation over institutional caution. Beijing may calculate that Trump is more flexible in private summit diplomacy than many of his advisors would prefer. If even symbolic language shifts emerge from the summit, Beijing would likely interpret them as strategic momentum. The third and perhaps most underappreciated possibility involves the Strait of Hormuz itself. Should China become integrated into any post-war maritime security framework governing Hormuz, Beijing gains something extraordinary: permanent institutional relevance inside the most critical energy choke point on Earth. Such a role would dramatically expand Chinese influence across Middle Eastern energy architecture without requiring direct military confrontation. China would effectively position itself as both economic consumer and geopolitical stabilizer of the artery through which much of the world's oil flows. And now comes the most important dimension of all. There is growing evidence that Beijing may not merely offer Trump mediation, it may offer him a staged diplomatic victory. Between now and the summit, China could quietly pressure Iran through back channels to signal limited flexibility regarding negotiations. Iran would not need to formally accept any deal. It would only need to indicate willingness to continue discussions under terms closer to Washington's preferences. That signal, leaked or publicly revealed just as Trump arrives in Beijing, would allow Trump to present the trip as an immediate diplomatic breakthrough. The optics would be powerful, Trump could claim China's involvement is already producing results. Xi could portray China as the responsible global stabilizer capable of managing crises Washington alone could not resolve. Iran would secure guarantees about what China intends to protect moving forward. All three governments would emerge with something politically useful. This pattern is not unprecedented. Modern U.S.-China diplomacy frequently relies on carefully prepared summit deliverables announced with maximum political visibility. Beijing understands that symbolic momentum matters as much as formal agreements, especially when both leaders need domestic victories. And Beijing appears to believe this is a rare strategic opening. One Chinese foreign policy advisor reportedly described the current situation as favorable to China. That statement reveals the deeper reality underneath the war itself. China did not initiate the conflict. China did not directly fight in it. Yet, China has benefited structurally from nearly every phase of it. Elevated oil prices strengthened Beijing's leverage over energy markets. Discounted Iranian crude benefited Chinese imports. American military attention became consumed by Middle Eastern escalation rather than Indo-Pacific competition. While Washington focused on war management, Beijing expanded room for maneuver elsewhere. Now, China stands at the center of the only credible diplomatic exit path available. And then, today, another development changed the equation further. Iran launched a public website for a newly established authority claiming administrative and security jurisdiction over maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. The website reportedly outlines governance mechanisms, coordination procedures, and security management structures tied to passage through the waterway. America immediately rejected the move as illegitimate, but the website remains online. That matters enormously because Iran may not be treating this merely as propaganda. It may be establishing the institutional foundation for a future post-war arrangement before negotiations formally conclude. If Hormuz eventually reopens under some internationally brokered framework involving Chinese participation, Iran could point to this newly created governing structure as proof that its authority over the strait was effectively acknowledged. Not fully, not officially, but enough. And Beijing's language today was extraordinarily careful. Wang Yi publicly supported the prompt reopening of shipping traffic through Hormuz, but avoided specifying under whose authority that reopening should occur. That ambiguity appears deliberate. It leaves room for negotiation. It leaves room for Iranian claims. And it leaves room for China to eventually emerge as both guarantor and participant in whatever structure replaces the current wartime reality. This is why Beijing's position has become so powerful. China now holds leverage over Iran through energy dependence. It holds leverage over America through trade and diplomatic necessity. It has communicated privately with Tehran days before hosting Trump. It has publicly supported Iran's nuclear rights while quietly encouraging maritime stabilization. And it has achieved all of this without direct military engagement, without public escalation, and without assuming the burdens Washington has carried throughout the conflict. Trump now heads toward Beijing, facing perhaps the most consequential summit of his political career. Xi Jinping enters the meeting informed, prepared, and strategically positioned between two adversaries who increasingly need China more than they wish to admit. And somewhere behind closed doors, the real negotiation may not simply concern ending a war. It may concern the price America is willing to pay for China to end it.